Offensive operations in Russia's war in Ukraine were thwarted by the resistance of the Ukrainian armed forces. Russian attacks on the eastern Ukrainian front lines, such as Bakhmut, Marinka, Lyman, and Solder, began to falter. For this reason, clashes between both sides of the war shifted to the southern front lines of Ukraine. The Russians began deploying naval forces in areas close to Ukraine's coastline, such as Berdyansk, Melitopol, and Mariupol, via the Crimean Peninsula and the Black Sea. 9 Russian warships were on combat duty in the Black Sea, including 2 missile carriers, with a total of 16 Caliber-type cruise missiles. A Russian warship in the Azov Sea also joined this fleet. There were a total of 22 warships in the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The Russians took action to include their navy in the Ukrainian battlefield. Russian leader Vladimir Putin apparently wanted to reactivate his navy when he failed to use his land army against the Ukrainians. However, the Russian ships had to withdraw completely in the face of the surprise counterattacks on the Ukrainian ports of Mariupol, Crimea, and Berdyansk. It is estimated that a total of 41 Russian ships were withdrawn, including 10 Russian warships in the Black Sea. So, what was the chain of events that started the withdrawal of the Russian ships and the attacks on Ukraine? There were reports that Russian ships had entered the port of Berdyansk. Some videos were published on social media indicating the positions of the Russian ships. From this moment on, the Ukrainian armed forces began to implement an incredible war tactic on the side of the Berdyansk port in the port of Mariupol and near the Azov coast of Melitopol, where the Russian naval forces are concentrated. For the Ukrainians, this breaking moment became a turning point in the war, and the Ukrainian armed forces primarily targeted Pryazovia near Berdyansk, where the Russian naval forces were trying to maneuver. Recently, the Ukrainian armed forces launched a massive missile attack on objects of critical importance to Russian troops in the occupied territory of Pryazovia. The Ukrainians targeted the Berdyansk seaport, which Russian forces used as a logistics center for the delivery of munitions and other military property by sea. According to the video released by the Russians, it is known that the Storm Shadow missiles penetrated the Russian air defense and reached the port. Currently, according to the information received from the local people, while ambulances are on their way to the port, some Russian ships are leaving the port. So, the Russians were worried after the Storm Shadow missile attack by the Ukrainians, and they withdrew these ships from the port to avoid endangering their navy. This attack was not the first case of Russian rocket attacks on infrastructure objects, because after the offensive operations against Pryazovia, the Ukrainian armed forces again targeted the Berdyansk region and especially the port. Here, at least 8 explosions occurred in the occupied Berdyansk region of the Zaporizhia region. Russian forces claimed to have shot down 6 rockets. It was reported that the port of Berdyansk was again the focal point of the missile attacks. With these attacks, the Ukrainians proved once again that they were determined to force the Russian naval forces out of this port. At the port of Berdyansk, the Russians began to increase security measures. But for the Storm Shadow missile attacks by the Ukrainians, much more powerful Russian air defense systems were needed in this region. The S-400 air defense system might have been the system Russia needed here, but the Ukrainian missile attacks were successful. The schools in the ports of Berdyansk reported that Russian ships had again escaped from the port of Berdyansk. All Russian warships, cargo ships, and civilian ships off the Ukrainian south coast were withdrawn. It is estimated that there are about 30 Russian ships in the ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol. A total of 41 Russian ships were withdrawn, including 10 Russian warships in the Black Sea after the Ukrainian attacks on Melitopol. The Russians could not afford to send their navy from the Azov coast to Melitopol, Berdyansk, or the coast of Mariupol. Currently, as we mentioned to you, Berdyansk was like hell for Russian Navy forces. Now, with the attacks of the Ukrainians on Melitopol, the coastal areas of this region were also dangerous for the Russian ships. But this time, the Russians tried their luck from the Mariupol direction. Ukrainian sources reported that they found traces of Russian ships on the coast near Mariupol. It was claimed that Russian submarines were also in this area. However, the Ukrainian armed forces carried out a striking offensive operation here as well. After the explosions at the base at the occupied Yurivka near Mariupol, the Russians were forced to withdraw from this area. Petro Andryaschenko, advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, reported that the attacks that took place here were very severe. Most of the attacks on Russian objects in the occupied territories exceeded the capabilities of modern Western systems already familiar to the Ukrainian forces, such as HIMARS. For this reason, it is possible that the Ukrainian army has recently activated the Storm Shadow cruise missiles, which it frequently uses in Mariupol. Therefore, it is believed that Russian Navy ships and submarines are moving away from Mariupol because the Russians arrested almost everyone working at the facility after the missile attacks in this city. Russian forces claimed that an insider was spying on the Ukrainian army. However, the Ukrainian armed forces had launched the offensive operation against the Russian ships, which had been maneuvering from the Black Sea to Ukrainian territory in recent days, long before the attacks on Mariupol. When we consider all these offensive operations organized by the Ukrainians, we can clearly see how Kiev neutralized the Russian naval forces by conducting ground attacks. As a result, the Russian deployment of naval forces in the coastal areas of Ukrainian cities such as Berdyansk, Melitopol, and Mariupol was prevented by the missile attacks of the Ukrainian forces. In other words, although the Ukrainian army does not have a regular naval force, Russia has not succeeded in establishing superiority in Ukraine with its warships and submarines, which it boasts. The U.S. military announced yesterday that it will increase patrols in and near the Strait of Hormuz, along with its regional partners, amid escalating tensions with Iran. The strategic waterway separating Iran in the north from Oman and the United Arab Emirates in the south has repeatedly been the site of tense exchanges between the U.S. and Iranian navies in recent months. Tensions between the two countries have increased due to some illegal actions by Iran. Last week, a Panama flagged oil tanker was seized by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Shortly before this seizure, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards seized the Marshall Islands flag near the tanker. The U.S. Navy said increased aircraft and ship patrols will be conducted with regional allies and partners, supporting multinational efforts to deter threats to merchant shipping and reassure regional seafarers. Iran's unjust, irresponsible, and unlawful seizure and harassment of merchant ships must end, the U.S. Navy's Central Command said in a statement. The U.S. Fifth Fleet and our partners are committed to protecting the rights of navigation in these critical waters, he said. According to the Navy tally, Iran has disturbed, attacked or interfered with 15 internationally flagged merchant ships in the last 2 years. It was stated that the actions violated international law and disrupted regional security. Iran's recent increase in its relations and military power in the region is one of the reasons for such actions. China's policy of détente, mediated between Iran and Saudi Arabia, is leading to a breathtaking regional paradigm shift in some corners and even the rise of a Beijing-based world order. However, the reaction of the Biden administration is presented as nothing to see here. US officials issued brief press releases downplaying the attempt to improve relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. When asked about the details of the interviews, among other things, it's a one-time situation. It was in China's economic interest to broker the deal. This does not translate into long-term alliances, and anything that helps calm the region is in the interest of the United States, they commented. This display of indifference also shows that the Biden administration is willing to fend off concerns that China is eroding U.S. global influence at a time when the Biden administration seeks solidarity with its partners and allies. Against what? Foreign Secretary Antony Blinken calls Beijing's threat to the rules ultimate. That's a good thing. A U.S. official said about the announcement that Beijing is brokering a deal to restore diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We want to reduce tension in the Middle East and we are working in this direction. People are not too upset about the fact that the Chinese have achieved this, he said. Other officials made similar comments that minimize the significance of the deal, all with anonymity to discuss a sensitive diplomatic issue. So how will this affect the interests of the USA? US officials stressed that the United States remains very preoccupied with the Middle East, citing recent military exercises, visits by U.S. diplomats, and President Joe Biden's phone call with the Sultan of Oman earlier this month. Given the growing rhetoric about the U.S.-China Cold War, it makes sense for U.S. officials to avoid the perception of panic, which could also point to weakness. In addition, both Washington and Beijing are concerned with a stable Middle East, particularly due to the region's central location in global energy needs. While the U.S. has more security interests, China has more economic interests. However, such assessments are directly in line with Biden's claims that the US and China are in economic and other competition at the global level. While President Biden insists he is not seeking a conflict, he and his team are trying to reduce their European and Asian allies' dependence on Beijing. While Beijing says the Saudi-Iranian deal does not reflect any selfish interest, it builds on the momentum of the deal. China plans to call a meeting of the Six-Nation Gulf Cooperation Council and Iran later this year. US officials reported. It is also reported that Chinese leader Xi Jinping plans to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky next week after meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. It is expected to put the recently announced Chinese proposal on a path to end the war. The meetings took place amid warnings that the United States could send weapons to Russia to help China in its war against Ukraine. So what does the Iran-Saudi agreement mean for the two countries? The deal will enable Saudi Arabia and Iran to re-establish diplomatic relations that were cut 7 years ago and reopen their embassies in each other's territories within 2 months. It also includes commitments to cooperate on security in order to reduce direct and indirect attacks on each other's interests across the region. In particular, US officials hope this will further reduce the misery in Yemen, where the Saudis and Iranians are in a proxy war but where the ceasefire continues. Michael Singh, the former senior director of Middle East Affairs at the US National Security Council, predicted that the Beijing initiative would likely expose divisions within the Biden administration. Saying, "The tension is good for the US. Yes, the Chinese are having their PR moments, but that's temporary." Others in the administration will reply that it is futile to go after these Gulf states. They are moving away from us, and even if they do not side with the Chinese, they will not be worth going after them with security agreements. Still, Singh, we shouldn't panic. He stressed that the fact of easing Saudi-Iranian tensions is actually in the national interest of the United States of America. The deal was arguably a turning point for China as it sought greater global influence. President Xi Jinping has launched a private global security initiative, which Beijing is marketing as an alternative to a US-dominated international system devastated by instability. Making a move in the Middle East was a special nudge in Washington's eyes. But China also had some advantages in this particular case. So what are the Chinese advantages? Unlike the US, Beijing has diplomatic relations with Iran, meaning it has Tehran's information. US relations with Riyadh are also bad due to differences in human rights. Beijing or even Moscow. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has run out of patience. Putin, who started to lose the war on Ukrainian territory, had to make critical decisions again. The Russian leader dismissed the Russian defense minister, Sergey Shoigu. Putin, who issued a red alert after the success of operations organized by the Ukrainian army within the borders of Russia, decided to dismiss Shoigu and replace him with Russian General Valery Gerasimov. Shoigu, who was dismissed by Putin, criticized the head of the Russian intelligence service, Sergei Naryshkin, very harshly. The whole world is waiting for the end of the war between Russia and Ukraine, but the war has now turned in favor of Ukraine. The Russian army has lost its strength of the first month of the war. There is an air of panic in Moscow as the Ukrainian army has infiltrated into Russia and seized the border towns in Belgorod on Russia's border with Ukraine. During a meeting to assess the situation, Vladimir Putin decided to dismiss Russian Defense Minister Sergey Shoigu and replace him with Russian General Valery Gerasimov. Before we get to the details of the news, let's give a brief information about the event that caused Vladimir Putin to get angry enough to dismiss Shoigu with the operation launched by the Ukrainian army in the past days. Pro-Ukrainian Russian Freedom Legion soldiers infiltrated into Russian borders wearing Russian military uniforms. The pro-Ukrainian soldiers not only captured two border towns in Belgorod, but also the Kabinenko administration building in the city of Belgorod. The Ukrainian soldiers who managed to push the Russian army back from these towns sent a message to Vladimir Putin and the Russian people. The commander of the Russian Freedom Legion said in a statement that they plan to liberate all of Russia from Putin's regime and that they will soon advance again on Russian territory to bring freedom to Russia. Such a statement by pro-Ukrainian Russian volunteers made Vladimir Putin very angry. However, the event that caused Putin's patience to run out was the airstrike on Moscow. Many buildings were damaged as a result of the air operation organized by unmanned warplanes against the capital, Moscow, having suffered millions of dollars in damages. Putin was very uncomfortable with the Ukrainian army's ability to operate so easily inside Russia's borders. Days after the Moscow attack, he held a meeting with senior Russian officials. At the end of the meeting, it was learned that Russian Defense Minister Sergey Shoigu was dismissed by Vladimir Putin. It could be understood from the face of Sergey Shoigu, who was the first to leave the room during the meeting, that the meeting was unpleasant. According to information obtained from sources close to the Kremlin, Russian leader Vladimir Putin held Russian Defense Minister Sergey Shoigu responsible for the attacks within Russia's borders. Putin, who is said to have expressed that there were imprudence in the security of the borders, stated that Minister Shoigu could not fulfill his duty well, and that some revisions would take place within the government. Thus, the first dismissed name was Sergey Shoigu, Russia's defense minister. However, Minister Shoigu refused to accept responsibility for these attacks on Russia and put all the blame on the head of the Russian intelligence service, Sergei Navalny. He said that the Russian intelligence service has many soldiers on the Russian border, but that he was not provided with the necessary intelligence. It is rumored that there was a verbal argument between Sergei Navalny and Shoigu over Shoigu's statement. However, these words were not enough to dissuade Putin from his decision. Now it is said that the new name to be appointed to the defense ministry is Valery Gerasimov, the Russian chief of staff. Gerasimov is also currently the commander of the Russian army in Ukrainian territory. After Gerasimov is appointed to the defense ministry, it is said that Russian General Sergey Shoigu will sit in the chair of the Russian chief of staff. Sergei Shoigu, who was previously dismissed by Putin, was the commander of the Russian army. However, after a few months in office, Russian General Shoigu was replaced by Valery Gerasimov. Although the dismissal of Defense Minister Shoigu has not yet been confirmed by the official authorities, this issue is much discussed within the Kremlin. Russian leader Vladimir Putin seems to have left the official announcement for later, due to the turmoil in Russia at the moment. However, the Russian people will be very uncomfortable with Putin's decisions to dismiss people on his own. Putin, who has never taken responsibility for any failure on Ukrainian soil, has always put the blame on others. For this reason, there have been a lot of reshuffles in the Russian government recently. However, these government officials who think that they have been unfairly dismissed have started to take sides against Putin. Dmitry Medvedev, who was previously Prime Minister of Russia, was also resigned by Putin. Medvedev, who showed oppositional attitudes to Putin for a while, was brought to a different post by Putin. Thus, Medvedev stopped opposing Putin. Now it is thought that Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defense minister, will oppose Putin in the same way. Vladimir Putin, who has been the Russian president for a long time, still had a higher voting potential until the war started. However, the economic crisis caused by the Russian army's invasion of Ukrainian territory and the rising inflation rates have significantly reduced Putin's approval rating. Well, assuming Putin now sees many people, including his own people, as a threat. Putin, who has started to exhibit paranoid attitudes, goes everywhere with his armored vehicle and dozens of bodyguards. Putin, who is afraid of being assassinated because of his dictatorial behavior, has increased his security measures considerably. Russian opposition officials have started working to turn the economic crisis and this war into an opportunity. Organizing speeches in many cities in Russia, opposition officials are trying to attract the public to their side, expressing that the Putin regime must come to an end. The opposition is trying to explain to Russian citizens that Russia is heading towards an abyss. According to independent polling companies, there has been a decline of more than 8% in Putin's voting rate since February 24 last year. Many expert researchers believe that Vladimir Putin will not be elected in the next elections. Alexei Navalny, the Russian oppositionist who made great efforts to overthrow Vladimir Putin's throne, wanted to run in the previous elections, but his candidacy was rejected. Since Putin knew that Alexei Navalny would be a candidate in the upcoming elections, he had to remove this threat. In recent months, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny has occupied a major place in the world media. Navalny, known for his opposition to Putin, was poisoned in an interesting way. Navalny, who did not want to be treated within Russian borders, was taken to Germany for treatment. Many people think that this was an assassination organized by Putin against Navalny. After his treatment in Germany ended, Navalny managed to survive and return to Russia. This time, however, the Russian dissident Navalny was arrested by order of Vladimir Putin. Navalny, who was arrested for reasons such as denigrating the Russian army and money laundering, was arrested by Russian security forces on the grounds that he committed a state crime. Navalny, who has been imprisoned for a long time, continues his struggle despite everything. Supporting the anti-war protests organized by the Russian people right from prison, Navalny published a text for Russian citizens stating that the Russian people are not slaves and should take to the streets and fight for the end of this war. Navalny asked the Russian citizens to continue their struggle against Putin. Vladimir Putin has now captured all branches of the state. For this reason, he can easily destroy every threat that comes his way. It is not only Alexei Navalny, who is currently imprisoned by Putin. Many Russian dissidents have been sued by Putin. In fact, it is not difficult to understand that these lawsuits are filed for threatening purposes. Those who continue to oppose Putin are prosecuted and punished. Opponents who remain silent can continue their non-independent politics. Many expert researchers believe that if the war continues like this, the Russian army will be forced to withdraw from Ukraine and Putin's regime will come to an end.